Chapter 2. A Right Gamble. Calvin Ayre has been called many things by many people. Scottish newspaper The Daily Record memorably referred to him as the billionaire son of a drug-smuggling pig farmer, while Craig Wright's ex-wife Lynn Wright referred to him during her testimony for the Kleiman v Wright case as the Canadian guy with the bad hair. Ayre's checkered past even exceeds Craig Wright's entanglements with authorities. Ayre's pig farming father, Ken, was arrested in 1987 for importing marijuana from Jamaica to Canada and was sentenced to 4 years in jail, with Calvin named as co-conspirator in the case, although no charges were brought. Ayre was appointed president of Canadian heart valve supplier Bisa Medical Systems in 1990 and took full control of the company in September of that year, following a falling out with the man who had appointed him. With Ayre at the helm, Bisa collapsed in under a year before being delisted from the Vancouver Stock Exchange in March 1992. Ayre was later found to have contravened several stock market regulations while in charge of Bisa, leading to a $10,000 Canadian fine and a 20-year ban from the stock exchange. Ayre was also banned from becoming or acting as director or officer of any reporting issuer and engaging in any investor relations activities. A few years later, Ayre tried another run at stock market success through a company called CyberRoad, which was in the business of developing technologies for online gaming sites. Ayre was supposedly the company's founder and visionary, but his vision didn't seem all that stellar. CyberRoad's stock price hit $6 Canadian in May 1999 before, in the words of the Globe and Mail, it skidded steadily downhill into financial oblivion, leaving Ayre nursing another loss. However, Ayre had already been preparing his final shot at riches while overseeing CyberRoad's collapse through the online gambling company Bodog, which he launched in 1994 at the dawn of the Internet revolution. Ayre finally hit gold as Bodog became a top performer in the Wild West of the early Internet gambling days, eventually making him a billionaire and allowing him to enjoy the trappings of such success. It also afforded him the chance to foster a penchant for grandiose claims on the scale of Craig Wright, such as his 2006 boast that he had slept with 8,000 women. The fact that Craig Wright in 2020 referred to Ayre as his mentor reveals as much about Wright as it does about Ayre. Ayre moved Bodog's headquarters to Antigua in 2006, but his prior flouting of the US gaming laws caught up with him in 2012 when he was indicted by the US Attorney for Maryland on charges of illegal gambling and money laundering. Ayre denied the charges, but the authorities persisted, even placing him on the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement's 10 Most Wanted Persons list in December 2013. Ayre's legal troubles led his associates at Bodog's Philippine base to try to claim elements of his empire for themselves, even allegedly going as far as trying to kidnap him, which was presumably one of the reasons behind his purported purchase of a bulletproof Humvee. In July 2017, having seemingly realised there was no way they were going to get their hands on him, the Department of Justice offered Ayre a plea deal. Admission of a single charge of misdemeanour and accessory after the fact, in return for 1 year of unsupervised probation and a $500,000 fine. Ayre took the deal. 3 weeks later, he was named Antigua and Barbuda's Special Economic Envoy following his decade-long charm offensive towards the Antiguan government. Ayre claims to have discovered Bitcoin in 2010, a year before Craig Wright did, and to have instantly realised its potential, telling the Globe and Mail, "The first moment I had it fully explained, I knew it was going to be huge." However, his first tweet referencing Bitcoin came on the 3rd of September 2012, linking to a piece on his website entitled "Can Bitcoin-Only Casinos Succeed?" By this point, Ayre was supposed to have cut ties with online gambling following his scrape with the law, but in a May 2021 interview, he let slip that this may not have been exactly true. "I was actually kind of an early investor in the cryptocurrency space, and in gaming we were flirting with it and using it for payments pretty early on." In fact, the vast majority of all the Bitcoin-related tweets Ayre put out between September 2012 and late 2016 were related to gambling, suggesting that, as former partner in crime Christian Aga Hansen claimed in 2023, Ayer was still a big profile in the gambling industry. Calvin Ayer and Stephen Matthews have both stated on multiple occasions that Matthews first raised the prospect of a potential investment in craigwright's businesses in the wake of the May 2015 lunch and dinner meeting. Matthews' most concrete reason as to why he chose to elicit Ayer's thoughts over Wright's proposal is that, as he told Mark Eglinton, he saw the Canadian as one of his closest allies, as both a friend and a business colleague, whose judgment he trusted implicitly. The truth, however, may be more prosaic. According to CoinGeek, in 2014, Ayer was looking to start a venture capital arm and sounded out Matthews for ideas on how to take advantage of the booming tech industry. Following their discussions, Ayer told Matthews that he wanted him to keep an eye out for opportunities in the Asia-Pacific area. By the end of the year, Matthews had unearthed the Holy Grail, Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin. We can be fairly confident that Matthews and Wright were in regular contact throughout 2014 as Wright's ATO crisis worsened, leading to the inescapable conclusion that the pair cooked up the Satoshi investment scheme together, a scheme that would benefit them both. Wright would be free of the ATO and the threat of prison, and Matthews would have fulfilled his brief of finding an investable asset for Ayer, which almost certainly carried a monetary reward. As we know, Wright and Matthews had eschewed any mention of the Satoshi connection to Robert McGregor that February, chiefly because Wright hadn't yet decided to don the Satoshi mask, but by the time Matthews pitched Wright to Ayer, this connection was the unique selling point. This is a clear indication that the ploy was concocted at some point in 2014. Craig Wright was already aware of Calvin Ayer by the time of the May 2015 meeting, with the precursor emails seeing Wright note that Matthews represents and runs Calvin Ayer's investment trust. Wright also provided links to 2 web pages about Ayer to his associates so they could do their own research on him, and it is unlikely that, for his part, Matthews hadn't once mentioned Craig Wright to Calvin Ayer until after that May 2015 meeting. Nevertheless, Hero Villain says that Matthews told Ayer one hell of a story about how he had known the inventor of Bitcoin for years without realising the investment potential, but now there was the chance to get in on the ground floor by doing just that. He also touched on, without going into too much unnecessary detail, some of the difficulties Wright was having in Australia. Which of the details Matthews deemed unnecessary would make for very interesting reading. In a May 2021 interview, Ayer said that Wright's stated desire at the time was to come back and save Bitcoin, something that Wright had never before expressed, and which was, therefore, news to everyone. This is unsurprising, however, given that the idea of Wright saving Bitcoin was cooked up by the trio at the start of 2021 in order to try to bolster the narrative around Wright's forthcoming legal battles. Indeed, Stephen Matthews has never suggested that Wright offered any such sentiments in their meetings, while, as we will see, Wright has denied that Bitcoin was ever discussed at all. This introduction of Wright to Ayer via Matthews is the pivotal moment in the entire Faketoshi saga, representing the moment when, if Justice Mellor's findings are to be believed, Wright and Matthews began their joint operation to defraud Ayer in order to rescue Wright. Taking the events of 2014 and 2015 in isolation, it might be possible to believe that Wright duped Matthews as he would so many, including Ayer, in the years afterwards, especially seeing as Matthews, in the words of Justice Mellor, had no idea that Dr. Wright was claiming to be the inventor of Bitcoin when they were reconnecting in early 2014. However, we have to remember the stories Matthews has repeatedly told about the receipt of the Bitcoin white paper in 2008 and the rejected offer of 50,000 Bitcoins for $500, or $100 according to Wright, the year after. Both of these stories, to which Matthews has religiously stuck over the years, were labelled false by Justice Mellor, the former of which he called a barefaced lie, noting that Matthews was a major player in Dr. Wright's campaign to establish himself as Satoshi for many years, and had been a significant supporter and purveyor of that lie. It is tempting, therefore, to suggest that Wright and Matthews used the May 2015 dinner meeting not to discuss Bitcoin or Wright's companies, but to shore up the plan they had spent months drafting up, a plan that would see Matthews leverage his connection with Ayer to bail out his friend on the premise of Wright being Satoshi Nakamoto. If Wright or Matthews is ever prosecuted over their respective perjury charges, the truth about what really happened in this crucial period may finally come out. When it comes to Calvin Ayre, the rationale behind his unswerving support for Wright in the face of years of failed predictions, broken promises, and disastrous legal campaigns has been the source of much debate. We have already discussed the financial cost to Ayre in backing Wright, but reputationally he has suffered too. When Ayre's history of supporting Wright in his attempt to overthrow Bitcoin has been pointed out to speakers booked into BSV-backed conferences, they invariably pull out. As we will discuss more in Volume 3, Ayre's support for Wright finally began to stall in mid-2023, with a leaked email from that September appearing to show that his patience had finally run out. Publicly, however, Ayre has to date maintained his belief in Wright's Satoshi claim, although many suspect he is now finally aware that he was the victim of a 10-year hoax. In May 2015, however, all this was many years and hundreds of millions of dollars away. According to Hero Villain, during the post-dinner phone call in which Matthews pitched Wright to Ayre, Ayre asked Matthews why he hadn't thought to mention that Wright was Bitcoin's creator before. Matthews responded by saying that he didn't think it was important, but an episode from the 6th of March 2014 calls this into question. On that date, American systems engineer Dorian Nakamoto was falsely identified by Newsweek as Satoshi Nakamoto, a subject that made headlines around the world and continued to do so for days afterwards. Matthews supposedly knew that Wright was Satoshi, and yet the identification of Dorian Nakamoto didn't spur him to tell Ayre, a Bitcoin supporter of some 4 years by this point, that he knew who the real creator was. There is also no evidence of Matthews and Wright discussing the matter, even to share a chuckle at the obviously erroneous reporting, all of which suggests that the wheels hadn't been put into motion by this point. Matthews convinced Ayre to meet Wright and hear his pitch, a meeting that Matthews said in his testimony for the Granath v. Wright trial took place days after the May lunch and dinner engagement with Wright. However, by the time Matthews was asked to write his Coper v. Wright witness statement, this engagement had shifted from early May to late May, with Matthews stating, "Dr. Wright and I landed in Vancouver in or around late May 2015. Shortly after Matthews' appearance at the Coper v. Wright trial, Hero Villain was published, where Matthews' timeline was appended again. Wright and Matthews flew separately to Vancouver from Sydney and Manila respectively, and arrived there an hour apart on Sunday, June 7th, 2015. Whenever it took place, Wright would have come equipped with a taste of what might be in store for Ayre were he to invest. On the 11th of May, De Morgan announced that it had been awarded a monster $54 million tax rebate under the Oz Industry R&D Tax Incentive Scheme, the biggest award to date. In the accompanying press release, De Morgan quoted Wright as saying that the approval had allowed us to tune our supercomputers to an RMAX, teraflops, 2468.15 and 939.67 respectively, which he anticipated would place them in the top 20 supercomputers globally and the fastest computer managed in the Southern Hemisphere. Wright added that the rebate would also allow us to start accelerating cryptocurrency and smart contract and property research to new levels in the Southern Hemisphere and to create opportunities in Australia that have not been imagined before. The press release also quoted Greg McKeon, Asia Pacific Service Director of De Morgan's computing partner, Silicon Graphics Incorporated, SGI, as saying that his company looked forward to a long sustained relationship with De Morgan regarding the supercomputers. The release ended with De Morgan saying that it had completed several Bitcoin-based research projects that have lasted over 6 years and are now ready to start commercialization. This press release was first discussed following Wright's doxing by Wired and Gizmodo in December 2015, where many of De Morgan's grandiose claims were examined and found wanting. Online sleuths discovered that the company never actually received the promised rebate, but it wasn't until 2023 that the story was exploded as a complete fiction, with evidence published online that De Morgan never even applied for it in the first place. This makes sense, given that the ATO had already accused Wright of multiple counts of abuse of the Oz Industry R&D scheme and withheld millions of dollars in related rebates. There was little chance they would agree to a $54 million payout at the same time. It cannot be a coincidence that Wright put out the spurious press release just as he was seeking investment into the company in question, a move that ultimately helped secure him his windfall. Matthews, Eyre and Wright met at Eyre's Vancouver home, according to Hero Villain, on Monday, 8th of June 2015, a date that Eglinton opined will forever be etched in history as when the process of saving Bitcoin began in earnest. Eyre, however, probably remembers it as the day when he first met the man who had come to dominate his life, for better, but mainly worse, for the next 10 years. Wright claimed at the Copa v. Wright trial that, during his first meeting with Eyre, he didn't mention that I was Satoshi at all, a claim that flies in the face of both logic and testimony from Matthews and Eyre. In fact, Hero Villain gives us a visceral description of the scene. Eyre looked at Wright, fixed his piercing sea-blue eyes upon his new acquaintance, and said, "I hope you're not offended if I ask you this." Eyre began, "But are you really Satoshi Nakamoto?" He confirmed to me that he was, and he did it in a way that was almost childlike, like a kid admitting something he was sheepish about but also proud of, Eyre recalls. Given that Wright's supposed alter ego was the only jewel in the badly burnished crown that he and Matthews were presenting to Eyre, it is inconceivable that Wright withheld this information. Eyre said in a May 2021 interview that he knew Wright was Satoshi from this very first meeting anyway, adding that Wright blew my mind with his passion, knowledge and vision for Bitcoin. This, however, is hardly surprising. Eyre also admitted that he was more of a businessman than a hardcore technology guy, suggesting that, despite already knowing about Bitcoin, he wasn't in a position to be able to challenge Wright on any of his theories or technical viewpoints on the protocol. Like many who have fallen under Wright's spell, Eyre was likely awed by the Australian's apparent in-depth knowledge of Bitcoin, which history has shown to be incomplete and erroneous on key issues, but which is impressive enough to hoodwink the uninitiated. Future N-Chain colleague Martin Sewell, who worked with Wright for 2.5 years, told us that the Australian was good at social manipulation, which masked his lack of knowledge. One of Wright's great strengths, and the reason he has been able to collect about him a cabal of individuals who retain total belief in everything he says, is his ability to talk on a subject with utter conviction, whether it is the finer points of cryptography or the history of Chinese notepad manufacturers, both of which he has publicly professed deeper knowledge of than experts in those fields. All too often, however, this knowledge does not stand up to scrutiny. Other N-Chain employees told us that when Wright discussed technical matters with specialists and PhD holders, it became painfully obvious he didn't have a clue what he was talking about. However, those without the requisite knowledge to challenge him often ended up believing and trusting him. Such was his magnetism and apparent depth of knowledge. There are some amateur psychologists who believe that Wright displays traits of narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, whose symptoms include inflated sense of self-importance, a belief in one's own superiority, a need for admiration, a lack of empathy, and a willingness to exploit others for personal gain. These are undoubtedly present in Wright, but he is still able to attract followers, although they typically represent the fringe of the fringe. Some of Wright's most vocal supporters include believers in numerology, supporters of the sovereign citizen movement, and COVID deniers. There is even a clutch who believes that Wright is being repressed by a global political conspiracy, out of fear that Wright's ideas and technology threaten their financial hegemony. It would appear, then, that craigwright appeals to those with a very high confidence heuristic, a trait first reported in 1970s psychological research. This research showed that some individuals equate confidence in speech with competence and correctness, retaining utter faith in the speaker's message, regardless of the truthfulness of their claims. This confidence heuristic is often exploited by cult leaders who prey upon those already disposed to believe them, reframing facts and events to suit their narrative, confident that their followers will believe them no matter what. As we have already seen, Wright is wont to alter history at the drop of a hat when contrary evidence presents itself, and yet his hardcore supporters continually believe these shifting stories over opposing facts, court judgments, logic, and common sense. The confidence heuristic could be one explanation of how Wright is able to maintain his support despite his often fanciful notions being thoroughly debunked, even in the very courtrooms in which he has publicly stated a desire to do battle. In an April 2021 interview, Calvin Ayre gave a brief description of what transpired at the Vancouver summit, as Hero Villain relayed. So, we had a meeting on my penthouse deck over a bottle of wine in June 2015, and we came up with a plan to save Bitcoin. By the time of Matthews' third YouTube interview in November 2021, this meeting had expanded to meetings, where the trio supposedly met over 3 days and discussed the problems with BTC and how Bitcoin should and could be saved. Ayer, too, had backed this suggestion in his interview 7 months earlier. There was a concern with where the technology was going, because the people Wright had handed it off to were taking it in a direction which would neuter a lot of the powers that he put into the original protocol design. This echoes Wright's story, which first surfaced around this time, that he had been kicked out of Bitcoin, rather than leaving voluntarily, as everyone supposed Satoshi had done. However, his March 2020 deposition for the Kleiman v. Wright case puts an entirely different spin on the meeting. I talked to Ayer about purchasing shares in a number of international banks because I thought it would be good. I also talked about a possible short on Deutsche Bank. I thought Deutsche Bank was overvalued, and I thought that would be a good investment, and I recommended that his family company should also do something like that. This discussion of Deutsche Bank was, Wright said, the only investment talk that happened during the entire trip, with no mention of Bitcoin or investment into his companies taking place. 4 years later, of course, Wright would change tack and claim that the first meeting between himself and Ayer had been convened over a sale of Bitcoins, leaving us no closer to the truth on that front. Incidentally, if Ayer had taken Wright's tip, it would have led to more disappointment. Deutsche Bank shares rose 25% in the 3 weeks after Wright's alleged advice to short it. It is painfully obvious that the purpose of the Vancouver meeting was to discuss a bailout for Wright and an investment into his companies by Ayer, with Wright's perspective clearly outlined in a summary of ideas and position document prepared in advance of it. In the document, Wright railed against the ATO's assertion that his business's only income was from tax returns, and added that he was in need of funding to fight his oppressors. It is also important to show the ATO that we are going to be strong and able to fight them. Going forth, if we can show strength, they, like all bullies, will back down. If we are only able to scrape enough together to resist and no more, they will see this as weakness and will not back off. Of course, if Wright's companies had been making money by legitimate means, he wouldn't have needed a multi-billion-dollar bailout in the first place. Wright added that a significant cash injection, even if it is by loan secured by the BTC wallet, would allow him to rebuild substance into the business, as well as pay Clayton Utz the $1 million he owed them, allowing the firm to represent him against the ATO. Wright was adamant that, with the requisite financial support, he could be freed from the shackles of directorhood and could set about inventing his heart out and making the kinds of products that he envisioned would take Bitcoin to the promised land. These majestic visions resonated incredibly well with Calvin, in Matthews' words, but this is no surprise, given that Matthews had already laid the groundwork for Ayer's investment by using his position as a trusted advisor to propose Wright as a money-making venture. After this first day of alleged lofty Bitcoin talk, the three amigos sprang out of bed early Tuesday morning, hero-villain, and took a short trip across Vancouver to the offices of Robert McGregor's Entrust. This meeting had, supposedly, been arranged in the wake of Matthews' phone conversation with Ayer after the May lunch and dinner engagement, which Matthews relayed in his Copa v. Wright witness testimony. When I spoke to Mr. Ayer the next day, we agreed to sit down with Dr. Wright and have a more detailed conversation in person in Vancouver. Mr. Ayer suggested that we introduce Dr. Wright to Mr. McGregor, who we both knew, who was based in Vancouver, because his company Entrust was doing things with Bitcoin and blockchain technology. I thought marrying everything up with Mr. McGregor was the most logical thing to do. It was in this witness statement that Matthews remembered that he had already tried to push Wright and his technology on McGregor in February 2014, meaning that this notion of marrying up Wright and McGregor was hardly new. He was, in fact, trying to hook the same fish with the same net, only this time the lure was much more attractive. The targeting of McGregor was hardly left field, given that the Canadian had worked for Riptown Media, an affiliate of Calvin Ayer's Bodog, in Vancouver for years, leaving to form Entrust in 2011 with a group of former Riptown employees. Matthews was testifying just weeks before the publication of Hero Villain, in which Wright hadn't quite got the message over the revised McGregor story from 2014. Wright told Mark Eglinton that Stefan had told me about Robert McGregor some time back toward the end of 2014, when, of course, the contact had been made that February. While Robert McGregor must surely have quizzed Matthews and Wright on why they hadn't mentioned the Satoshi link in February 2014, this conversation is sadly not recorded. When the trio arrived at the Entrust office, it appeared that there had been a mix-up. Robert McGregor wasn't there. Nevertheless, the meeting went ahead, with McGregor dialing in remotely from overseas. According to Hero Villain, McGregor was baffled as to why he had been invited in the first place. McGregor, meanwhile, from his vantage point staring back from a screen on the wall, was seemingly a little blindsided and unaware as to why he'd even been asked to join. As Eglinton recounts, a frosty meeting saw Wright nearly involved in a shouting match with Entrust employees due to their dismissal of Bitcoin in favour of a proprietary blockchain, and ended with Wright challenging the company's CTO. Before anyone else could speak, Wright bristled visibly. In an instant, he went from a relaxed seated position, arms folded, to leaning forward, hands flat on the table, and staring straight back at the CTO. "It's okay," he began. "You can give me the answer in machine code if you prefer. I read machine code." After the fractious encounter, McGregor supposedly called Matthews. Hero Villain says immediately, Matthews says when they returned to Ayer's home, to complain that he felt the trio had ambushed his company and employees. This story, while feasible from the Wright angle, is undermined by an email not seen until it was produced for the Coper v. Wright case in 2023. The email, sent by Calvin Ayer to Matthews, McGregor and Wright just hours after the meeting concluded, saw Ayer thank McGregor for his time, calling the meeting especially helpful for him in highlighting the advantages to the consumer and to the organisation for Entrust to bolt the cryptocurrency platform onto it. Ayer then added that he had instructed Wright to write up a small document that outlines his thoughts, adding that he hoped Matthews, Wright and McGregor could meet at a point in the future to discuss it. McGregor's reply, sent the following morning, showed no sign of any antipathy towards the trio. "Many thanks again for making time to speak with me and for your patience with my seemingly perpetually shifting schedule. And thank you as well, Craig, for your thoughts as to the potential applicability of these technologies." Matthew's story, already fraying at the seams, is further strained through Ayer's reply to McGregor. Craig also mentioned he found your presentation helpful, so will address all of it in his document he is doing up for us. Suddenly, Robert McGregor wasn't just a confused man on a screen, but he was giving a presentation, despite allegedly having no idea the meeting was happening. There was also evidently no fractious discussion over Bitcoin whatsoever. Instead, it was clearly a very cordial affair, with Matthew's 2014 vision of using Wright's technology within Entrust evidently going down better than it had the prior year. The existence of such positive communications also eviscerates Matthew's claim, made in both his Graneth v. Wright and Coper v. Wright testimonies, that McGregor was initially angry and dismissive of the concept of using Bitcoin after the meeting, only to come back into the fold in mid-June. Why Matthews felt the need to reframe McGregor's cooperative approach is not entirely clear, although it can be assumed that this was part of the general effort to smear McGregor during the Graneth v. Wright and Coper v. Wright cases. Both Matthews and Wright laid into McGregor with gay abandon whenever the chance arose, blaming him for all the negative aspects of the circus of manipulation that would take place in Wright's as yet unplanned public proofing sessions in 2016. Matthews was not faced with these discrepancies during his cross-examination for the Coper v. Wright trial, a fact that is all the more surprising given that 17 months earlier in the Graneth v. Wright trial he had denied the possibility that McGregor was involved in the Vancouver summit at all. Counsel: the meetings in Vancouver, did they produce any immediate results? Matthews: no, but after the meetings in Vancouver, Mr. Ayer and I both concluded that the most relevant person that we could introduce Craig to be involved in this discussion was Robert McGregor. How, then, could Robert McGregor have attended the meeting with Matthews, Ayer and Wright if he had only been considered as a potential partner for the first time after that very set of meetings had concluded? This attempt at gelling multiple contradictory stories together is emblematic of the problems Matthews has created for himself by constantly changing his story, something that happens so regularly he likely couldn't recount the truth if he tried. Unfortunately, Robert McGregor has not said a word in public about his experience with Wright, Matthews and Ayer since featuring in Andrew O'Hagan's June 2016 piece, The Satoshi Affair. We are only able to offer conjecture as to why McGregor has declined to speak on the matter in the years since, but seeing as his reputation in the business world was severely damaged by his experience with craigwright, his silence is almost certainly an attempt to put the spectacle behind him. McGregor's absence from the record means that we can only view this period of history through the joint prism of Matthews, Eyre and Wright, which, as we have seen, is fraught with difficulties. One of the very few certainties is that, at the second time of asking, McGregor was brought on board, although, according to O'Hagan, this was after initial scepticism and in spite of a slight aversion to Wright's manner. The Vancouver summit ended, according to CoinGeek, with Eyre giving Wright his marching orders to prepare for due diligence into his companies. Wright returned to Australia, while Matthews headed back to the Philippines, preparing to join Wright in Sydney to carry out his due diligence and assess the lie of the land with regard to Wright's companies. This would have come as a major surprise to Wright if we are to believe what he said in his March 2020 deposition for the Kleiman v. Wright case. Counsel: Dr. Wright, in 2015, were you in discussions with Calvin Eyre about buying your Australian businesses? Wright: No. Counsel: Were you in discussion with Calvin Eyre about buying intellectual property that belonged to you or your Australian companies? Wright: No. Wright must have been baffled, therefore, when, on the 10th of June, Eyre emailed him, Matthews and two other associates with an investment plan, which included a bailout deal that would see Wright pay what the ATO was demanding in back taxes and penalties, as well as Clayton Utts' $1 million bill. Eyre proposed the establishment of an Antiguan company which would borrow $8 million, money that would be used to kickstart the next stage of the process, which consisted of going after the $50 million, referring to Wright's non-existent $54 million De Morgan rebate, and getting all the patents filed. Here, then, is more evidence that Wright manufactured the record-breaking rebate as a ruse designed to reassure Calvin Eyre prior to his investment. Wright's patents and associated projects were to be rolled into McGregor's Entrust company, with the company ready to expand if more money is released from the tax department. This involvement of Entrust so early in proceedings rings the death knell for Matthews' claim that Robert McGregor wasn't initially interested. In response, Wright said he would rather fight the ATO than settle, a battle he said would cost an extraordinary $18 million, adding that he was confident that Eyre would get his money back through, of all things, an R&D tax offset directly related to the bailout deal. On top of this, Wright said, a victory against the ATO would see $65 million in rebates and offsets unlocked, compared to shelling out millions in settlements. Eyre, perhaps not as confident in Wright's chances, went ahead with a settlement plan. Matthews says that he arrived in Sydney to begin due diligence into Wright's companies on the 18th of June, which fits with email exchanges involving him from this period, while Robert McGregor, having agreed to at least take a look at the books, arrived a few days later. Ahead of the visit to De Morgan on the 24th, Ramona Watts asked a favour of Alan Pedersen. Stefan and others come into office tomorrow from noon. If by any chance you are in the vicinity, please pop in. It may at least look like we are still doing business. Ramona added that, even if they bolstered the number of people in the office for one day, the Canadians will be in the office till Friday, acknowledging that it would be hard to explain the absence of staff for the rest of the week. A skeleton workforce would hardly back up Wright's assertion, made in his investment pitch, that De Morgan was still a thriving business. During the Coper v. Wright trial, however, Wright denied that things were this bad, claiming that some staff were working part-time or from home rather than the company simply no longer employing them. This suggestion, however, is further undermined by what Stephen Matthews told Mark Eglinton. Craig told us that he had had to stand almost all of his staff down because he'd had no money to pay them for 2 or 3 weeks. Ramona's efforts to make the office seem busy failed. Matthews found the De Morgan office a ghost town, with no staff, still open laptops on the desks, open books, and even printed pages still lying in photocopier trays. With no staff to work around, Matthews and McGregor began going through Wright's paperwork. About 5 days into his due diligence, Matthews discovered a room bulging with files, including blockchain-related research dating back to 2006, long predating Bitcoin's launch. This story emerged for the first time in CoinGeek's How Bitcoin Was Saved in July 2022, despite Matthews and Eyre being given several opportunities previously to divulge it. Further seeding the cloud of suspicion that hangs over this story is the fact that not one of these files has ever seen the light of day. This suggests one of two things. Either they've been lost, or they never existed in the first place. The idea that the files have never been tracked down is remarkable, firstly because they must have been in the IP handover when Wright's bailout deal was concluded, but more importantly, the presentation of just one document detailing the concepts around Bitcoin or blockchain technology and dating from pre-2008 would be a slam dunk for Wright's Satoshi claim. Yet not only have they never surfaced, but they have barely received a mention in any of Wright's court cases based on his assertion that he is the father of Bitcoin. Perhaps unsurprisingly, by the time of Matthews' testimony for the Coper v. Wright trial, crucial details over the discovery had changed. The plethora of blockchain-related research dating back to 2006 had been reduced to a lone research paper, and the discoverer had changed from Matthews to Robert McGregor. McGregor has never confirmed finding anything of the sort. Readers may draw their own conclusions regarding the truth or otherwise of this story. Following his arrival in Sydney, Matthews spent almost every day with Wright going through the mess Wright had created for himself. Matthews liaised with a team of lawyers just to be able to fully understand the corporate structure, the intellectual property that existed in the corporate structure, what the relationships between the entities were, and what the web of intellectual property looked like. While they were doing this, Calvin Eyre and his associates were working on the bailout package and mapping out how they would monetize Wright and his IP. A 22nd of June 2015 email saw Eyre object to Wright's confrontational approach with the ATO and reveal plans for a secret Bond villain-style development layer. It is my gut instinct that we should pay the key staff and you to move to Scotland, where we set up a clandestine R&D that is not disclosed to the world unless and until we are ready. We then clean up all the rest of the stuff in Oz in a precise, measured and unhurried way so that we get it all right. I do not think we should be wasting much energy fighting the Australian Tax Department. Eyre confirmed that the $8 million loan to Wright would be secured using the bitcoins you have in the trust in Panama, suggesting that Wright had sold the Canadian on the trust he had initially tried to use as proof of Bitcoin ownership with the ATO, only to later reject the suggestion that he ever mentioned such a trust at all. It also proved that Wright lied in his March 2020 deposition for the Kleiman v. Wright case, when he told his deponent, "I don't believe I told anyone I had a Bitcoin trust in Panama." Eyre told Wright to establish the proof of existence of the Bitcoin trust and who can sign on its behalf, a trust that Eyre would later wish he had done much more due diligence on. Wright explained the deal in the same deposition. The deal was I would nominally sell, Eyre's group, 100,000 Bitcoin. That would then be put against the money, and either they would keep the Bitcoin or it would be repaid. Eyre was due to collect this windfall in June 2020, although, as we will see in Volume 3, this never transpired. At this point, just days after the Vancouver summit, Wright must have been stunned at how well his and Matthews' plan was working. The ATO was going to be off his back, and he was going to be the head of a purpose-built blockchain research centre. Things weren't going too badly for Matthews either. He left his role as CTO of Taish Consulting and took on a full-time role as Vice President of Venture Capital and Investments at Calvin Ayre's The Sterling Group. Just one thing stood between Wright and his dreams: the ability to prove that he had $8 million worth of bitcoins in a Panama trust. There were only two problems with this. There was no Panama trust, and even if there was, Craigwright didn't have $8 million worth of bitcoins to put in it. But he knew a wallet that did.